I want to acknowledge that our campus, where I'm joining from in Seattle, sits on the unceded Sammamish and Duwamish lands and waters, which are part of the shared waters of tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. So I was invited here today to talk about climate anxiety and eco-grief. I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes, hopefully a little bit less, and then leave some time at the end to hear from all of you. And I know that some folks sometimes have to log out early, so if you can't stick around for the whole session, but you want to learn more, you can check out my podcast or my website, where you'll find all of the research and the articles and the concepts I'm about to cover in my slides. So how do you start a climate talk, right? You typically list off a bunch of really bad news, which is quite easy to come by in a time of back-to-back historic wildfires. So many hurricanes in the Atlantic last season, we ran out of alphabet and had to start naming them after Greek letters. Disappearing wildlife, melting ice sheets, record-shattering temperatures, dying oceans, displaced communities, vertebrate wildlife, populations down by 60%, tens of millions of people forced to flee their homes every year, 1 million species at risk of extinction. And we could go on, but you already know the story. And when you follow these news headlines and scientific reports or come to climate talks like this, you get pulled into this cycle of heartbreak, where the situation seems to hit a crisis point in some category, only to do it all over again the next year. Someone once described this phenomenon in our climate situation as broken record breaking, and that really stuck with me. And so in addition to this external damage that scientists and activists are working on, there's also that landscape of damage we carry inside of us. Grief, anger, numbness, fear, trauma for some. You probably felt one of those dark feelings come to the surface as you were looking at those images and listening to that list of horrors that are both unbearable, but also utterly normal in our times. This emotional toll, we'll go back to the last slide. The psychological tool is really becoming a lot harder to ignore. And you see evidence of that in the rise of these terms that didn't really exist in the mainstream vocabulary a couple of years ago. The term eco-anxiety made the shortlist for Oxford's Word of the Year in 2019. You also sometimes hear this referred to as climate trauma, eco-grief, pre-traumatic stress. There's a whole series of words. Whatever we call it, it has become so prevalent that in 2017, the American Psychological Association put out a major report documenting climate disruption as a mental health crisis. So their official definition of eco-anxiety is a chronic fear of environmental doom. But for most people I know, the term is used for any number of emotions beyond anxiety. So for some people, the main response may be grief or shame and guilt, can be anger, numbness. Britt Ray is as a science writer, she has one of my favorite definitions. So after looking at all of these terms for eco-anxiety, she wrote, at its simplest, at this late stage in the climate crisis, it is merely a sign of attachment to the world. So I want to pause for a moment before we dive in here to ask you if you're comfortable to share where you're all at, just to kind of get a sense of the feelings swirling around in this particular group. So I'd ask you to take a minute to write out something that could either be a couple of lines or just pick a word or a phrase to share in the chat. And I've actually given two options. Option one, when you think about our climate future, how do you feel? And then option two is more about the present. So what is your primary dark emotion in response to climate change right now? I think even if you've never heard or a term like eco-anxiety or talked about it, you've probably just noticed this heaviness in your own life. If you're involved in environmental issues or taking classes on the subject, I really started to pay attention to that emotional toll when I saw how much it was affecting my own students at the University of Washington. So on this slide, these are some quotes from the first day of class when I asked them that same question, particularly about the future. And I've heard things like, I'm not going to have children because it would be cruel to bring kids into the world just as it's ending. Or they say that they wake up in the middle of the night from nightmares about social breakdown. And then some of them are experiencing climate trauma directly from having grown up in polluted communities that are now suffering health effects themselves. So this is where the topic really hit home for me, because if young people are already giving up hope by the time they're 19 or even younger, then how are we going to sustain the kind of momentum that we need to work through the long emergency ahead? Oops. So I'm going to come back to that question at the end as well. But first, I want to take a couple of minutes to identify who is impacted by climate grief and anxiety beyond students and young people. That's the group I know best because I work with them every day. But of course, we also have frontline communities who are the ones that are truly experiencing the brunt of climate disruption and the most direct harm. As always, it is the poor and overwhelmingly Black, Indigenous, and communities of color who suffer the heaviest impacts. So, of course, then the worst emotional toll. Hurricane Katrina gets cited all the time, partly because there's just been so much research done on it. The APA showed that 1 in 6 people impacted met the diagnosis for PTSD, and suicide or suicidal thoughts more than doubled for displaced people in New Orleans. And this is a pattern that follows every climate disaster. That toll on mental health is really exactly what you would expect in a system that takes communities who already lack access to affordable housing and healthcare and emergency services, not to mention mental health services, and then dumps the heaviest climate impacts on top of all of that. For Indigenous people, traditional hunting and cultural practices are being wiped out by a warming climate. So Arctic communities are a really visible example of this, where they can't travel to ancestral sites or hunt in the old ways because the landscape is melting. And that's another group where suicide has risen very dramatically. And you can see the way the Nunatsiavut people put it in their own words on this slide. This is taken from that documentary, Lament from the Land, where they document their responses in their own words. And this is really a quintessential example of what's meant in identifying something as an existential threat, right? It's a threat to your life and survival, but also your identity, your culture, your entire way of being in the world. So for that reason, the current experience of climate justice is magnifying past traumas, past and ongoing traumas for colonized people. Nyla Burton has a really powerful article on this, and I put the title up on this slide, but I think it's an important one if you do any follow-up reading after today. So I also included a link to it on the resources page of my website, which I'll share at the end. Then the second group that suffers some of the highest rates of depression are scientists, since they're the ones that are running these terrifying projections and documenting so much loss in our natural world up close. Every one of my colleagues in the natural sciences has a really, compelling personal story about why they went into their line of work, which is based on like personal connections or experiences, their love for forests or coral reefs or whatever species of wildlife they study. So of course, they're going to experience trauma from watching the death and disappearance of their life's work. Through a few of these. And then finally, the general public is also reporting increased levels of distress and alarm over climate change. 62% of Americans now identify as being concerned or very worried, according to the most recent surveys, and these come from the Yale Program on Climate Communications. Because everybody's daily life is changing, especially when we think about the really incremental and sometimes almost invisible changes that creep up on us, like the loss of birds and or birds and bees, or the gradual decline of snow that accumulate over time. Those annual fishing trips where you come back with less and less every year. I know many of us are joining from the West Coast, so we might think about the number of days where you can't see the stars because of the wildfire smoke or even the sky. And so all of that adds up to a really deep and personal sense of loss, which is what philosopher Glenn Albrecht calls solastalgia. And I bet most of you have actually heard that term now. He's playing on the concept of nostalgia a longing for a time or a place that you can't go back to. But solastalgia happens while you're still at home, and it just becomes unfamiliar. So the official definition is a homesickness experienced without leaving home. And solastalgia is not just something that sentimental environmentalists are impacted by. In parts of coal country like West Virginia and Eastern Kentucky, scientific studies have shown that rates of clinical depression are significantly higher in areas with mountaintop removal than in other coal mining areas in the very same region. And the quote on this slide is from a West Virginia resident commenting on her depression after the surrounding landscape was demolished by mountaintop removal. So that's just an overview of a few ways these climate emotions are playing out. I want to acknowledge that there is both a mobilizing potential and a danger beneath this mainstream rise in climate anxiety and grief. On the one hand, people who've been activists for a long time might actually be relieved when they see headlines like this. It's very understandable. And this, again, is referring to that latest survey by the Yale Program on Climate Change Communications. They run the project you might have heard of about global warming's 6 Americas, which has been gathering data on our attitudes going back to 2008. And in the most recent study, 26% of adults in the US characterized climate change as alarming, which is more than double the number who gave that response in 2015. And it's almost 4 times the number who say that the climate isn't changing at all, which is now only 7%. From 2014 to 2019, the proportion of alarmed people nearly tripled. And so there is good news here. If you think that 6 years ago, this ratio of Americans who are alarmed about climate change to those who were dismissive, what many people call deniers, that ratio was about 1 to 1. And it's hard not to feel relief when for so long, much of our energy as climate activists was going into convincing people that the science was real. But now that it's flipped, we've got a different problem on our hands, which is this emphasis on apocalyptic outcomes and the way that immobilizes people as opposed to motivating them to take action. So just one really quick example of this reversal. Many of you are probably also familiar with Michael Mann. He created the hockey stick graph of carbon emissions and is probably the most well-known climate scientist in the US. Mann has spent well over a decade in these legendary Twitter battles and media debates, just tirelessly debunking the most prominent climate deniers of our time. But recently, he's had to redirect all of that energy to now rushing around debunking climate doomers who say it's too late and we're totally screwed. So just 2 of many dangers that I might point out for this new situation really kind of boil down to fear and defeatism. The first one, fear, is not a viable long-term strategy. It can be an effective wake-up call at the outset, but when we stay in that space of alarm and panic and stress and dysregulation, that's where we get to the point of burnout that you saw on that slide with quotes from my students. And we've all seen headlines like this on the slide and the stories that cover them, game over for the planet, 10 years until imminent collapse. And research shows that fear-centered headlines like these do not motivate people over the long term. Instead, we're immobilized by a sense of hopelessness. And really, that's the best case scenario. At its extreme, climate alarmism and fear can fuel white supremacist xenophobia. It can lead to justification of authoritarianism, nativism, shutting down borders, infringing on reproductive rights of Black and Brown women. My colleague, Sarah Jaquette-Ray, has a new series of articles on this danger of climate alarmism feeding white supremacist eco-fascism. There was one out just a couple weeks ago that she published. It's the one quoted here in Scientific American. And then I'm also really worried about the impact of this messaging on really young people, like teens and children, who are already dealing with rising depression and suicide rates. And now you have this rise of climate apocalypse that is feeding that anxiety and helplessness. Then the second risk posed by this surge in apocalyptic narratives is defeatism, where people assume it's already too late and there's nothing we can do now, which is not true. Even if we overshoot our target of 1.5 degrees warming, which we will likely do, and we're on track for that, 1.8 degrees is still way better than 2 degrees. And 2 degrees is dramatically less catastrophic than 2.5 or 3. So, on the one hand, you have this swirl of unacknowledged ecological emotions that I highlighted at the beginning of the talk, that have traditionally been dismissed or ignored, the kinds of things that you shared in the chat. I've struggled with those for such a long time. And part of the difficulty is that there's just not really a forum where those are recognized, and in classes, those are not things that many students talk about or have a place to share. And then on the other hand, you have this rise of this doomer-fueled despair. And the two are probably both related to each other. So Mary Inez Hegelaar has really brilliantly analyzed this experience of this growing doomer mentality as a manifestation of white privilege. And she calls out the fact that climate doomers are overwhelmingly white men with pretty large microphones and platforms. So they're positioned on one end of the spectrum of climate communicators. And on the opposite end, there's that traditional contingent of climate scientists who police any expression of emotion in public communication, which Hegelaar finds equally problematic as a Black woman who's on the front lines being told that speaking openly about anger and grief are counterproductive or not the proper tone for advancing climate action. So on this slide, I want to read this. Here's what she has to say about this dilemma of being squeezed from both ends. This is the part in bold. She writes, both smack of the privilege wrought from the deluded belief that this world has ever been perfect, and that, therefore, an imperfect version of it is not worth saving or fighting for. Both represent two sides of an overprivileged pendulum swung too far. And then she continues below the box. It is absolutely possible to prepare for the disasters already terrifyingly upon us, while also doing our damnedest to quit baking more in. We can acknowledge the storm of emotions that comes with watching our world unravel, process those emotions, and pick ourselves up to protect what we can. So this leaves us with the big question of our time, which is how then do we honestly acknowledge what's happening without pushing those dark feelings back into the shadows, but at the same time, keep ourselves from falling into despair or worse when we do face up to those truths, right? Can we rechannel that anxiety and grief more productively? So the answer to that question is yes, I firmly believe. But before we can jump to those concrete strategies, and I do have a handy sort of 5-step list for you at the end. Before we can get there, we really have to do something that's a bit harder, which is to reframe the way we think about so-called negative emotions in the first place, and to really reimagine our relationship with grief and anxiety. So this is what I try to help listeners do in my podcast, Facing It. The whole series is really about, how even though it seems counterintuitive, grief can be a valuable resource and an ally in the fight for climate justice. So I'm going to read a 3-minute excerpt from an episode that introduces this. When I first launched my seminar on eco-grief, I was every bit as distressed as my students and looking for ways to extinguish my pain for all the suffering. But something unexpected happened along the way. I had always thought of grief as a bad thing, a dark state to avoid or overcome as quickly as possible. I thought that feeling grief was like succumbing to a preventable illness, or that once it took hold, I might fall into a bottomless hole of despair. But in time, it dawned on me that maybe we were seeking solutions to the wrong problem. We all wanted to fix the way we felt so we could go back to feeling happy. But grief isn't something to be fixed because it's not dysfunctional. It's a healthy and necessary process we have to undergo in order to heal. In fact, grief can be a tremendous source of wisdom as we move into an uncertain climate future. I know this may sound controversial in a moment when environmentalists are urging us to focus on hope, but the two are not mutually exclusive. And for many people, grief may be an even more powerful force for transformation. First, grief isn't just one of many options for accepting loss. Grief is the process of accepting loss. I get why many people working towards sustainability want to sidestep emotional issues and push the public straight into action. The situation is urgent, and dwelling on our feelings can seem like an extravagance as the fires close in. But the problem is when we try to jump straight to the final step without first processing the emotional toll of all this lost beauty and life, we're bypassing the very insights that motivate us to fight for our world in the first place. Ignoring ecological grief is like trying to rush through any great loss, a job, a home, someone you love, without pausing to acknowledge what you're leaving behind. In all those cases, we're not just losing something we once had. We're also losing the future many of us had counted on. So again, that's an excerpt from the second episode. But as the podcast goes on, I'm really trying to push beyond just reframing grief as something that's not bad, to also consider ways that it is actively good. And there are 4 insights that support that reframing. I'm only going to touch on the first 3. The first insight is that grief arises from deep attachment and connection. I mean, it is a sign of love for our world. And I always remind my students, you will not grieve for something you don't love. Grief is a way of honoring and affirming our connection and our empathy with other species or people. It reminds us that our existence and our well-being are deeply entwined with other lives. And there is really no emotion that's more powerful than love in motivating us to fight. It's more effective than fear and anger and all the rest. When you're motivated by love, there's just no limit to how long you'll stay engaged or how deeply you'll invest yourself. And grief and love are just 2 sides of the same coin. They're not opposites. They really are mutually dependent and mutually reinforcing. Then the second positive aspect of eco-grief is that it challenges artificial boundaries that we create between ourselves and other species, as well as other humans. So we live in a culture where, as we keep seeing again and again and again, some lives matter and others don't. Some deaths receive elaborate tributes and mourning rituals, while others are trivialized or ignored. And of course, groups like Black Lives Matter and people seeking justice for murdered Indigenous women and trans and homeless and LGBTQ activists know firsthand how that absence of public grief dehumanizes them, which is exactly why they deliberately use public protests and vigils to ensure that those deaths aren't pushed into the shadows. Frances Weller is an expert in grief and bereavement, and I found this quote so powerful for framing all of those relations between grief and justice. Weller writes, "The proper response to any loss is grief, but we cannot grieve for something that we feel is outside the circle of worth." And then that connects to the third point that many Indigenous scholars have made about grief as a way of confronting the legacy of climate colonialism. So I'd like to use this example of a research study by Ron Reed, who's a traditional fisherman and a researcher from the Karuk tribe in California, where salmon are part of his community's identity. And he's written that when his tribe, like so many other Indigenous people in North America, talk about community, they're also including plants and animals and land, which they consider to be sacred relatives. So that inevitably leads to grief when they're destroyed. But, and this is a quote from his essay, he writes, "Because the dominant non-native society does not recognize the deep emotional ties we describe between humans and the natural world, Karuk grief and other emotions related to their loss is invisible." And that invisibility and lack of legitimacy compounds the harm done to Indigenous people. This is referred to as disenfranchised grief, a loss that is experienced but can't be openly acknowledged or publicly mourned. Okay, so I'm going to actually move through this last one. I've been looking at ways that folks in the arts, actually, maybe I'll go back to this last one, that artists are really embracing mourning as a way to counter that practice or that sort of structure of disenfranchised grief. One example is Remembrance Day for Lost Species, which has grown into a worldwide movement of community memorials and events for extinct species. Extinction Rebellion also uses overt funeral symbolism like coffins and mourning processions in its activism. Artist Chris Jordan, I really like his work. If you get a chance to check him out, this is from Daniela Molnar, and both of them sort of use their arts as healing rituals in their own right. Okay, I need to take a breath myself. So from here, I want to turn to the strategies that I promised that have helped my own students navigate climate grief and anxiety, but I ask you to please keep in mind those insights I just shared, that the goal is not to extinguish grief, but to channel it toward meaningful social transformation. So one of the most powerful places to start is simply acknowledging and making space to talk about our emotional responses within climate work and education, like the kind of thing that you just did in the chat at the beginning of this session. It sounds too simplistic to be of much value, but it's a lot more profound than it appears at first glance, simply because a huge part of the depression and anxiety in response to our crisis comes from feeling alone and isolated. And when we feel isolated, we are not empowered to step forward and to take action. So talking about emotional responses can help create that sense of community and solidarity that we need to become engaged. And when I teach that seminar, where I survey students at the end of the term as well as the beginning, over and over what they say is that the single most helpful thing about the class was being in the room with others who were talking about their struggles and being heard themselves when they also voiced distress. So I do want to stress that you don't have to be a trained therapist to do this. I certainly am not. This is really just about having conversations, which everybody can do. Then, as I've also indicated, talking openly about eco-anxiety is a way of connecting and building community. So number 1 and number 2 are really deeply linked. But the other point I'll make here is that, oftentimes the source of our despair isn't the crisis itself so much as a longing for fellowship or the absence of a sense of purpose in the midst of difficulty. And Rebecca Solnit's book here on this slide is really the best account I know in making that point. The title is A Paradise Built in Hell. It's just packed with meticulously researched examples of how throughout history, when you look at periods of crisis like wars and natural disasters, people's spiritual lives and deep sense of meaning are not inhibited because of those events. In fact, the opposite is often true, that the sense of purpose and fellowship that we crave can be deepened through adversity. If we seek out community, right, and respond collectively, right, to make the world better, or just fix the immediate problem at hand. There's actually a great joy and often a sense of adventure in knowing that you're part of a historic movement that is rising up to confront the greatest challenge and injustice of your time. So in terms of the climate crisis, the really good news is that the solution to the existential loneliness that many of us feel is also the solution to climate change, right? It all lies in solidarity and collective action. And if you don't know where to go to find that connection, please go to the resources page on my website. I've listed a number of groups that meet virtually, some in person, to have these discussions and build community around eco-anxiety. You can either take part in their meetings, or they will give you templates and instructions to facilitate your own. So the first one listed here, the Climate Courage Workshop, is really great. It actually has a very international group of participants. The Good Grief Network is also fantastic. They've been around for quite a few years now. Okay, and then number 3, what would happen if we reframed anxiety and grief as tools that empower climate solutions? I already covered some of this, I think, but the one that I will add is, I've been really concerned about the tendency to pathologize feelings of sadness or anxiety as a disorder. And that just needs to be rejected outright, because framing climate anxiety as a mental illness or a condition locates the problem in the individual instead of the social structure. So rather than thinking of it as a dysfunction, I really encourage my students to understand eco-anxiety as a moral emotion, a response arising from an accurate assessment of the situation and a sense of compassion and desire for justice. And I'm by no means the first to say something along these lines. You can see the quotes here, the first from Jiddu Krishnamurti: "It is no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society." And then, of course, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., "The salvation of the world lies in the hands of the maladjusted." So these insights apply to other forms of emotional maladjustment, whether we're rejecting racism or violence or inequality or climate violence. So as you're having conversations with others and sharing your dark emotions, we need to help each other recognize responses like this as signs of emotional health and compassion. So think of what you just saw in the chat from a few minutes ago, right? This is one of the most powerful things you can do for someone or for yourself. And I've listed some examples on this slide. I already discussed how grief should be honored as an expression of love, but we can also recognize how our anger and outrage arise from a sense of injustice. Or when a person shares something they fear about the future, that reveals trust and courage to speak openly. Or we might also think about how shame and awareness of complicity can ultimately open the way toward actively dismantling systems of oppression if it's channeled into collective political action. Okay, so for the sake of time, I'm going to skip number 4. I'm just going to wrap up with this last one. And again, you can find all of these strategies on my website or my podcast if you want to dive in more. But this last one, get engaged and take action. The one caveat, in a longer version of this talk, I say a lot about how I want to be careful about this recommendation insofar as the impulse to immediately jump to action should not be a way to avoid dwelling with hard feelings. And we see that a lot in our culture. But of course, then it's also important to remember that in the same way that action shouldn't excuse us from self-reflection, neither should our painful feelings excuse us from doing the work. We can feel devastated and still commit ourselves to rolling up our sleeves. And the good news is that diving into the work is itself a powerful antidote to despair. So this is the answer I always give when people ask, how do we maintain hope? And, the answer is, my answer is, don't get hung up on cultivating hope. Hope is the natural outcome of doing the work. And when I talk about action, there's no single prescription, right? There are endless ways to get engaged. You should just start wherever you already are, and what it is that you're good at or passionate about, whether that's writing or video game designs or changing our finance or our food system. It could be about pushing cleaner energy at your school or your workplace, or working with kids or old people, whatever, again, taps into what you are already passionate about, because that is what's going to keep you from burning out over the long run. We are going to be doing this work for the rest of our lives. And so the environmental movement really would be wise to reclaim pleasure, the pleasure of activism, and think about that as a strategy when you decide to get engaged or decide how to get engaged. And then, of course, I also want to clarify that, when I talk about taking action, I'm not promoting this naive belief that someone planting trees or going to a march or designing an eco video game is going to solve the problem. The real power really lies, again, in helping us build solidarity. And that's what happens when we get engaged. Cognitive psychologists are emphatic about this point, that how important it is to imagine ourselves as part of a team. And that's partly for the reasons I already discussed about, how purpose and connection can counteract loneliness, but also because working as a team addresses the practical concern that our individual actions are too insignificant to matter. And this is something that I see my students hitting this wall all the time, just feeling so helpless and overwhelmed because their personal impact just seems dwarfed by the scale of the crisis. So the conclusion that we can come to is just, why even bother? It's that sort of drop in the bucket imaginary. But if we see ourselves working collectively rather than individually, then you can recognize that all contributions sync up with a larger network of change. And this is what Adrienne Marie Brown calls emergent strategy, a movement that spirals out from all kinds of small local actions and connections to create complex systems. If you aren't familiar with this book, it is just a must read, and I highly recommend picking it up. Very, very inspiring. An economist, Donella Meadows, actually makes a very similar point. I have a quote from her at the bottom when she reminds us to think about leverage points where a small shift in one thing can produce big changes in everything. So I want to leave time here. I'm going to skip my last example. It also comes from Rebecca Solnit. But let's see, let me get to the last slide here. So again, I've included my social media info where I post new talks and workshops and podcast episodes if you want any of those updates. And then again, if there's a particular reading or individual that I mentioned on one of the slides and you want to follow up on them, just go to the website to the further readings and resources page, and I've listed all of those there.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. This has been an amazing experience and much needed, and dare I say, makes me feel more hopeful